Hello, my name is Adrian Goldberg, and welcome to the Byline podcast from the Byline Times. It's what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report, and what telly doesn't tell you. This time, England's local election results 2024 Part 1. The headline is whopping losses for the Conservatives, one of their worst performances in 40 years, according to the pollster John Curtis. They will take a few crumbs of comfort from Ben Houchen's victory in the Tees Valley mayoral election. Votes in London and the West Midlands are eagerly awaited. We'll have a part 2 of this podcast out on Sunday. But in the parliamentary by-election for Blackpool South, Labour won with the third biggest swing in post-war by-election history. All this would suggest that the Starmers can start looking at the curtain patterns for when they move into Downing Street. But there is one disturbing current for the Labour leader: suggestions that areas with large numbers of Muslim voters may be deserting the party because of its stance on Gaza. I'm joined by Shaista Aziz, a former Labour councillor who quit the party last October for precisely this reason, and the Byline Times political editor, Adam Bienkov. Adam, let's start with you. Give us the overall picture then. Pretty glum for the Conservatives, I would imagine, and pretty chipper for Labour.
Yeah, I think at every local elections, it's always said that these are quite mixed results. And it's certainly the case that the results we've seen so far are not uniform. There are Labour performing stronger in some parts of the country than others, and the Conservatives similarly doing worse in some parts of the country than others. However, I think the overall picture is very clear. As John Curtis said, this is one of the worst local election results in 40 years. The BBC's projected national share, which shows what the result would be if these were repeated across the country. And it puts the Conservatives on their lowest ever result in the PNS, joint lowest ever result, equal with when they got the same result in 1995, and actually worse than they got in 1997 before the general election. Labour got their landslide. Just looking at the most significant vote in terms of the general election, the Blackpool South by-election, the Conservatives got 17.5%, which is actually the lowest result they've got in a seat they were defending in a by-election for at least 100 years. It's not all plain sailing for Labour, as you say. The party does seem to be actually losing votes in areas, particularly where there is a large concentration of Muslim voters. And those voters appear to be going either to the Green Party or to independent candidates. And that does appear to be due to anger over Gaza. From Labour's perspective, they seem to be playing that down somewhat, largely because the seats where Labour are going backwards in terms of Muslim voters tend to be, in parliamentary and general election terms, quite safe Labour seats. And they believe that their vote has become more efficient, and they can afford to lose some votes in areas where they've got safe seats because they're gaining so strongly in areas that they need to win back in order to win the general election. Unfortunately, this has led to some slightly over-enthusiastic briefings from some Labour sources, and actually some quite disturbing briefings from West Midlands, where Labour sources have been suggesting that actually it doesn't really matter that we're losing Muslim voters, and even suggesting that Muslim voters don't really count as proper voters. And the party nationally has been very keen to shut down some of that and disown some of that comments. But it's now undoubtedly the case that this isn't one-way traffic as far as Labour and the Conservatives are saying. But the overall picture is very clear. This is a terrible day for the Conservatives. Obviously, lots more votes to come in. We've got several more mayoralties to come. Interestingly, in London, where the polls suggested just a couple of days ago that Labour have got a massive leads of up to 22 points, there's real nervousness. Speaking to some people around Sadiq Khan, they believe that it's very close, and actually there's a possibility that Susan Hall could win this despite those big opinion poll leads. That would be a remarkable result if that actually turns out to be the case.
This is not an isolated set of results either, is it? Last year, the Conservatives lost 1,000 council seats, evidence of tactical voting. They're on course to lose another 500 council seats again, with voters deciding in areas where Labour might win to go for the Labour candidate, in areas where the Lib Dem might win to go for the Lib Dem candidate. So there is clear evidence, a pattern of anti-conservative voting with any particular support for the opposition parties.
And that kind of tactical voting is why Labour's vote now appears to be so efficient. In previous elections, national and local, the Labour Party had a record of piling up votes in seats that they were already winning. and doing less well in areas of the country in marginal seats that they needed to win in order to win the general election. That seems now to be reversed. And actually, across the board, voters appear to be becoming quite well aware of what they need to do to vote out the Conservatives. And what Labour are hopeful about in terms of some of these areas where they seem to be going backwards is that will turn around by the time we get to general election. Of course, that remains to be seen.
Yeah, and just to say, we're recording this podcast on a Friday tea time. There will be a follow-up podcast which will release sometime on Sunday evening. And in the meantime, on Saturday at 4 p.m, there will be a live broadcast involving Peter Jukes, the executive editor of the Byline Times, a discussion about the by-election results, by which time the major cities, including London and the West Midlands, will have declared. To find out where that is, just check out the X feed of the Byline Times and watch or listen to that at 4 p.m. on Saturday. Shaista Aziz, welcome to you. You quit the Labour Party because of its stance over Gaza, so it's no surprise, I suppose, that you would be not voting Labour in these elections. But you've got a story of a much wider sense of disenchantment with Labour from amongst family and friends who are Muslim.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for having me back on. I've been a lifelong Labour voter. I've been a Labour councillor for the last 7 years. So through COVID, through the cost of living crisis, and many other very, very challenging situations. And I never in my wildest, nightmares thought I'd have to resign from the Labour Party over principles around access, humanitarian access, upholding international law, and basically having to call out the leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, for his words, which he spoke on national radio to basically say it was okay for collective punishment to be administered against the civilians of Gaza. That was 7 months ago. 7 months on, more than 35,000 Palestinians have been killed, 15,000 of whom are children, and at least 70,000 Palestinians have been injured. Many have life-changing injuries, amputations, and other horrific injuries. So that's what's happened in the last 7 months. At the same time, what's also happened in the last 7 months is the contract between many working class people and communities, including Muslim people and communities, and Labour has been severed. Yesterday, I went to vote in my city of Oxford. It was the first time in my life that I didn't vote Labour. It was the first time in my life that all my family, every single member of my family, including my extended family members, didn't vote Labour. We are a Labour family through and through. My late dad came to this country to rebuild Britain post-war, along with my aunties and uncles, and they've been trade unionists. Many of them are retired now, but they've always voted Labour. And generations of my family have decided that we cannot vote for Keir Starmer's Labour Party, and we're not the only ones. I would also like to make this really clear. It's not just Muslims, it's many other communities as well. And over the last few years, we've heard a lot from Labour about the Red Wall. Well, I would say to Labour that we are the Red Wall. The multiracial working class communities across this country are turning their backs on Labour for a number of reasons, including the catastrophe that's unfolding in Gaza. And any attempt to suggest that it's only Muslims who are doing this is completely disingenuous. Adam, you rightly pointed out some horrific commentary that has come out in the last hours, particularly around the West Midlands mayoral race, where a senior Labour Party source has been quoted as saying, and this is a direct quote, "It's the Middle East, not the West Midlands, that will have won. The Conservative candidate, Andy Street, the morality. Once again, Hamas are the real villains." This is unbelievable. When I resigned from the Labour Party, I was the first Labour councillor in the country to resign very early on. I'm a former international aid worker. I've spent my entire life advocating for humanitarian access in conflict-impacted zones. So I knew what was going to happen. Anyone who's followed the trajectory of the occupation of Palestine, which has gone on for more than 75 years, knew pretty much what was going to happen. I don't think we would have ever imagined it would have been this horrific, though. So I resigned very early on. And when I resigned, along with a number of other Labour councillors, Labour Party sources were going to the media referring to those of us who resigned as shaking off the fleas. At the time, quite a significant number of councillors who resigned were British Muslims. So I would say here that the Labour Party has a very big problem. It's an Islamophobic and racist problem that they clearly have amongst people who like to anonymously provide quotes to the British media. And I would like to know who these people are. And by the way, I've asked the Labour Party who these people are. I've gone right to Keir Starmer's office. At the time, I was told when the fleas comments was made that these comments weren't made. Later on, I was told they were made. So Sue Gray should open an immediate investigation to find out who in the Labour Party, which allegedly is a government in waiting now, is busy briefing the British media with the most horrific racist and Islamophobic comments. If this was any other group of marginalised people in this country, there would be calls for that investigation to take place. And Labour has been very quick to point the finger at the Tories when it comes to Islamophobia, which obviously they are culpable of, but they need to get their own house in order. And for anyone to suggest that any British citizen who is absolutely befret at the carnage and devastation that we've all been witnessing through our live feeds and through the media coverage in Gaza is some sort of threat to national security and a fifth column is an absolute disgrace.
I wouldn't disagree with that for one moment, Shaista. If we look at it through the prism, though, of election results, which you look at a place like Oldham, where 1 in 4 residents are Muslim, Labour lost 5 seats to independents, but the Muslim population of Oldham is significantly higher than it is in most other areas of the UK. And people will have many other concerns. It may be that they are also extremely concerned about the situation in Gaza, but they will have concerns about the cost of living. They will have concerns about crime, for example. So do you think this will really have a significant impact on Labour's general election results? Because the suggestion is that actually it won't make that much difference overall.
Well, I think it already is making a difference. And you're absolutely right with what you said, Adrian. Muslims, we're British. We're part and parcel of British society. We're part of the fabric of this country. We've built this country. We have a legacy of being in this country for a very, very long time. So we're not kind of some sort of random group of people. You know, the day to day, all the issues that impact everybody in this country impact us. The cost of living, not being able to afford, our bills, concerns around the environment, concerns around 0-hour contracts, the NHS, all those things. Of course, the structural issues that we have in this country impact all of us. And disproportionately, British Muslims live in poverty. We live in the worst social housing. We have the worst job prospects. All the data shows that. And it really speaks to the structural racism in this country as well. So the issue of Gaza, however, feeds also into domestic issues in this country. So when I resigned very early on in October last year, I wrote a piece for The Guardian where I explained that for many British Muslims, when we see the doublespeak and the hypocrisy that has been applied to Gaza, we can also see how Palestinian lives have been diminished and devalued. And we see parallels, many of us, in terms of how we're treated. We've got senior Tory ministers, some of who have had to resign from their jobs, sprouting Islamophobic nonsense, making horrific commentary about, grooming gangs and suggesting all Muslim men are responsible for that. Of course, no one can deny that, Muslim men have been involved in these horrific crimes against women and girls, and rightly so, they should be prosecuted and the law should be applied to them. But to suggest that, it's being done because of a race and because of a faith is all part and parcel of demonizing British Muslims. And this demonization has gone on for a long time. And when it comes to Labour Party, they have banked on our votes for too long and almost been cavalier with their approach to getting votes from our communities. And they've also upheld systems, clan systems in these communities which don't benefit anyone, which lock out women and younger people, for example, and those who have more pluralistic views, shall we say, about society. So I think that what's happening here is really significant for the Labour Party. And I think any attempt to sort of diminish what's going on here is, I think, an attempt to try and kind of get a grip on PR and trying to get their messaging right, because this is not good. The Labour Party is hemorrhaging votes, not only from Muslim communities, working class Muslim communities, from a number of communities. So they need to deal with this. They say that they want to be the party of equality, and they claim that they're an anti-racist party. Well, the evidence is lacking, isn't it?
I think there's a sort of couple of things going on here. I think when it comes to the general election, which is only going to be, potentially within a couple of months, potentially 6 months, I don't think what's happened in Gaza and the undoubted backlash within the Labour Party is going to change the result of that election. I think that's unlikely. However, I do think it is a serious and a real problem for the Labour Party that they are already losing votes among some of these communities before they're even in government. And I do think there is a tendency, both in the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, to not take Islamophobia as seriously as an issue compared to other problems of racism and religious prejudice. And this can cause a problem in the longer term. I mean, we saw what happened with the Jewish population and anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. For a long time, the Labour Party refused to take that seriously, and it did end up seriously damaging the party over the course of the years. And I think there is a tendency within the Labour Party to take certain communities and certain sections of the vote for granted. And we've seen that in the past in Scotland, for instance, where the party dominated for so many years, assumed and basically effectively took its eye off the ball, what was happening north of the border, and ended up completely collapsing. And only now, many years later, starting to build their vote back up in that area. And something could happen in some Labour strongholds with large Muslim populations, but also in some metropolitan areas with lots of younger voters who could also feel taken for granted and switch to the Greens. And I think that's possibly a trend that will become more apparent once we do have a Labour government. And I think, as I say, these local election results do suggest that it's almost certain that we will be getting a Labour government later this year.
I don't deny we're almost certainly going to get a Labour government, and I don't deny the wider context that you've just provided there. I think the question is, yes, Labour will win, and what does that mean for everyone who has decided that they can't vote for Labour at the moment, like you say? So Labour will win, but they cannot say that they've won and they're taking the multicultural working class communities of this country with them, because they're not. Specifically Muslim communities, but others as well. And that is a story that they cannot tell. I've just got back from Marseille, where I was working there, and I don't want to see a situation in our country where we've got more and more people from particularly Muslim backgrounds who feel marginalized and disillusioned, as they do in France, from the mainstream political system. That is not going to help anyone. So Labour does need to get a grip on this, and it needs to work out what it's going to do. And if I'm frank with you, I don't really see a way back right now for them.
Adam, I just want to clarify as well, and Shaista's quite rightly drawn attention to a pretty vile comment by a source quoted by the BBC around the West Midlands mayoral election. Labour officially has condemned that quote as racist, but they say, and this was the quote, it's the Middle East, not the West Midlands, that will have won the mayoralty, that once again Hamas are the real villains. Labour says the Labour Party has strongly condemned this racist quote, which has not come from anyone who is speaking on behalf of the party or whose values are welcome in the party. So just to absolutely clarify that as an official Labour comment on this. Adam, overall, are there any other threats to Keir Starmer from what we've seen in these local elections, or apart from this very serious issue that we're discussing with Shaista, is it effectively plain sailing to Downing Street? Can he start eyeing up the curtain patterns?
Well, of course, I think the Labour Party see the biggest obstacle to them winning the general election is complacency, and they're sort of keen not to play up their prospects too much. But I think, as I say, I think it's hard to see too many chinks in Labour's position other than what we've already discussed. As I say, I do think we have to wait to see what happens in London and how much of the nervousness we're seeing and the briefings we're seeing is sort of expectations management from both sides. If the party does do badly in London, that could suggest problems for incumbency once the Labour Party is in government and taking unpopular decisions. Sadiq Khan took the decision to expand the ultra-low emission zone, the clean air zone in London. That has proved hugely controversial in parts of the capital and has undoubtedly led to his candidacy suffering over the course of this campaign. That's something I think that Labour will be looking towards when they're making their own decisions about what they're going to put in their manifesto and what the choices they're going to make if and when they do get into government. But in terms of the results that we've seen so far, there isn't, I mean, give or take a couple of results. I mean, the Conservatives are pointing towards the Tees Valley result and Ben Houchen. And it's certainly the case that there's a couple of mayoral results that Conservatives have clung on to, where they've got strong candidates who are sort of well liked in their areas. The swing towards Labour has not been as large as it has been in other parts of the country. But even in Tees Valley, Ben Houchen, when he last fought that contest, he got, I think, 73% of the vote. That's now down to 54% of the vote. And if that swing was repeated across that region, I believe the Conservatives will be on course to losing all of their parliamentary seats in that area. So again, even looking at the most sort of optimistic prospects for the Conservatives, it's still not looking great for them in terms of the general election. So I think overall, it's looking pretty rosy for Labour, albeit there are some potential warning signs about what could be coming down the track.
Yes, and as for Rishi Sunak, as you say, he takes heart from the Ben Houchen victory, but Labour won the York and North Yorkshire mayoral race with a majority of almost 15,000, and York and North Yorkshire encompasses Rishi Sunak's constituency of Richmond. I mean,
yes. and there was one poll this week, YouGov poll, giving Labour, showing the Conservatives down to their lowest ever result this Parliament, lowest poll standing down to 18% in the YouGov poll. If that were repeated in a general election, Rishi Sunak would lose his seat in that general election, and that would truly be an incredible result for a sitting Prime Minister to lose his own seat. But looking at these results in Yorkshire, that doesn't look beyond the realms of possibility.
Will he still be the sitting Prime Minister when we go into election? As always, when these results come out, there are noises of unity from amongst the Conservative Party. David Cameron who's currently in Ukraine, the Foreign Secretary, former Prime Minister himself, saying that Rishi Sunak just has to stick with the plan. But if results like this are repeated at the general election, many Conservative MPs are going to lose their jobs. Do you think that they will stick with Sunak, or is there a possibility, which has often been mooted in recent weeks, of some kind of leadership challenge?
I think there's always the possibility. I don't think it's going to happen. I think the overwhelming mood among Conservative MPs is resignation about what's coming. They don't believe that changing leader now is realistically going to change matters for them. It's still possible, but I think you could tell that it's not going to happen by the kind of hurdles that they were setting themselves. So the rebels, those hoping to oust Rishi Sunak, were saying, well, if Andy Street loses a seat, if Ben Houchen loses, then we'll move against them. That's a pretty high bar, and I don't think that was ever sort of realistically going to happen. And I think since we've got these results coming in now, there's been a notable lack of senior Conservative figures coming out saying Rishi Sunak needs to stand down. I think the time's running out, and I think the Conservative Party, the overwhelming sentiment is we just need to make a best of a bad job and try and make our way through to polling day and try and stem these losses. Because switching now, there's not an obvious candidate. Penny Mordaunt is the name that's often spoken about, but she doesn't have universal support on the Conservative benches, and the polling, which does show that she is more popular than Rishi Sunak, it doesn't show that she would be doing the Conservatives doing significantly better under her. And indeed, most voters don't really know much about her anyway, and she's untested in that role. So it would be a huge risk for the party to take. It would make them look incredibly chaotic to have yet another leadership election, particularly so shortly before a general election. So I think all of that combined means that although it's possible that something else could happen, that the Conservative Party finally decides that they've had enough of Rishi Sunak, I just don't think that's where we are right now.
Adam, thank you very much indeed for your time. Thank you as well to Shaista Aziz. Just to remind you, if you want more by-election coverage, there will be a live broadcast. Check out the Byline Times X feed for exact details on that. That will be on Saturday at 4 p.m. You may, of course, be listening to this after that time. But we will also be putting out another episode of this Byline Times podcast, which we're going to record on Sunday evening, sort of washing up all of the local election results. Thank you, Shaista. Thank you, Adam. And don't forget, if you want to support the Byline Times podcast, take out a subscription over at the Byline Times to our brilliant monthly newspaper. Full details at bylinetimes.com. This has been a We Bring audio production in Birmingham for the Byline Times. We'll see you again soon. Cheers now. Bye-bye.